Hi everybody, as you're coming in from the waiting room, thank you for waiting. My name's James Cateridge. I'm going to be the host today from the Creative Industries Festival here at Oxford Brookes University. We do have events going on for the whole of May, so if you like what you see today, if you enjoy the event, please do check out our website and sign up for some more events. We're still not done yet by a long shot. Today's event is called We're All Photographers Now, but we don't know what that means. It's going to be chaired by Grant Scott, who is former art director of Elle and Tatler magazines and is also a photographer, a podcaster, a writer and a documentary filmmaker. In fact, he's made a film which we are screening as part of the festival, which you can see marketed on the screen behind me, just over there. We're going to be screening on Thursday a film called Do Not Bend, which is about the photographer Bill J. So please come along to that on Thursday evening if you can. And Grant is also currently the subject coordinator for BA Photography here at Oxford Brookes. So I'll hand over to Grant and he will introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks for that kind of brief background. I think the one thing that all of the panel kind of share is that we've all spent time in a big building on the corner of Hanover Square, known as Vogue House at some point. But I'm going to just let everybody introduce themselves. So first of all, Fiona Hayes.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, James and Chang. Thanks, Grant. So I'm an art director. I'm a designer, and these days I'm a lecturer as well. And I spent most of my career in magazines. I've been the art director of 10 titles at various times, including GQ in India, House and Garden here in London, Punch, Eve, British Cosmo, Russian Cosmo Company, and Vogue in Russia twice. I worked for Condé Nast, for Hearst, for BBC and various other places as well. And I've been involved in a lot of magazine launches. I'm also product placement time. I'm the art director of this, the Fashion Yearbook, which launched in April. And it's a celebration of the best international fashion photography, editorial and campaigns. And yeah, that's me.
Okay, thanks,
Gaby?
Fiona. Gaby.
Oh, hi, I'm Gaby Cove. So I worked at Condé Nast for 11 and a half years. I was head of photography for all of the digital brands and latterly for Vogue globally. And I'm a picture editor by trade, and it's lovely to meet you.
Okay, thanks, Gaby. So I thought about the idea of having a conversation about where photography is today. And I thought, well, let's just make a statement. And that statement is that we're all photographers now, but we don't really know what that means. I'm sure that a statement alone can create enough debate. And we've kind of had a brief chat between the three of us earlier to just get a sense of what we mean. And we're going to spend this period of time just addressing that issue. There won't be any presentations or so forth. This is very much a free-flowing conversation, and at the end there'll be time for everybody to throw in some Q&As. But of course, if you feel the need to make a comment, please add that to the chat as we're going along, and one of us will pick up on it at some point, I hope. So really, I suppose what I wanted to kick off with is that idea of a statement which is often made and often, I suppose, put forward as from a negative perspective, which is that we're all photographers now, and therefore photography is in a terrible state. Now, I actually believe differently to that we're in a great state for photography and that there's a real sense of democratic nature to it. However, what it does impact upon is the professional photographer. Oh, disappeared. The professional photographer who's actually trying to make a living. So all three of us have at different points commissioned photographers. I've worked as a professional photographer, still do, for the last 20 odd years. So we can see it from both the light side and the dark side. So what I want to just kind of kick off with, perhaps Fiona, you'd like to address this, is where are we at the moment in the difference you perceive between somebody who has a camera and somebody who has a professional photographic practice?
Well, I would say I'm going to slightly dodge that and say it's in the eye of the beholder. There's a surprise. It's slightly dodging it, but it's in a way it's in the eye of the beholder and the eye of the commissioner, because I don't want to talk so much about what makes you a good photographer or a legitimate photographer or so on, but I think that the second half of the topic then was, we just don't know what that is. Now that's the really, really key thing for me. I think that the state of photography at the moment and how photographers are regarded has been very much influenced over the last few years, obviously by the rise of smartphones and so on, and the internet and everything, and also by cost cutting by people who commission photography, and that's the same in, you know, magazine industry particularly. You know, there have been cutbacks and cutbacks and cutbacks. Back in the 90s, when I was working at Hearst, you know, I had a picture editor and her assistant, and at the end of every week or every couple of weeks, we would have a time when photographers would come in with their portfolios and show us their work, and we'd sort of be thinking about how to use them going forward and stuff. Nowadays, very few places, well, lots of places don't even have full-time picture editors. So that's really fallen by the way. And as part of that, there's less and less understanding of the importance of a photographer. And there's one thing that I just fell down a rabbit hole before I came in here, but I just thought this is really telling. So on my Instagram feed this morning, Jamie Lee Curtis, you know, Jamie Lee Curtis, the actor. So he posted a set of images from Palestine, and her caption is something about very strong images and God bless the photojournalists who are bringing these images. And she reposted it from Getty, but there were no credits for any of the photographers. And then when I had a look at the original Getty post, they have credits, but they're in the caption. So if you actually click on any of the images, you still don't know who they are. These are serious people risking their lives to take pictures in a war zone, and they're not getting the credit. I mean,
yeah. Well, you know, when we were talking previously, we were talking about the importance of education, weren't we? And the education of the commissioner as well as the photographer, and whether or not the photographer knows now where they actually sit in that kind of relationship. Because I think there was a time when it was very much a question of collaboration, and I think it's got to a point of them and us. Well, what do you think to that, Gaby?
It's always dangerous, this point where something becomes democratic, where it's completely unregulated. And, you know, we had a rather lovely old-fashioned system of respect and people understanding the rules, because it was rather a small, closed-off kind of bunch of people. And the wonderful democratization, I'm a fan of it, is extraordinary to watch, and it's been very rapid. But it's really dangerous because people don't understand what they're kind of doing when they repost something. And, you know, Facebook, who owns Instagram, and Google, they all know that, but, you know, they're being encouraged to post stuff without really understanding the ramifications.
So in a sense, my feeling is that over the last sort of 15 years, 20 years, everything's changed and nothing has changed. Because actually the rules that existed pre the digitization and the democratization and the mass kind of ownership of photography by everybody with a phone in their pocket has continued. But actually the old rules that we were all brought up on the idea of commissioning and copyright and publishing and usage, they actually do still remain in law.
Yeah, I mean, they have to, because, you know, intellectual property, it's kind of how we all earn our money. And so it's always going to come back to, you know, people being respected in a lawful and in a financial sense. But I do think that there's a missing piece where I think that those big tech companies should be being more responsible with educating people on the responsibility of reposting things.
I think that one. I was just going to jump in there and say, when we were chatting about this earlier, the three of us have examples of people who have power in publishing companies, let's say at the moment, who just were not educated in any way about what a picture is, and the fact that it's not just something that you took or your mate took on your phone and then you can do whatever you like. And examples of where people would take an image that was commissioned for a Vogue, for example, and that cost a lot of money to make, and that had a lot of rights attached, including model release, including the territories where it could be used, whether it can be used on print and online and so on. And they're just kind of like, oh, there's a nice picture. And the famous one I always bring up of the guy who came in who was pretty senior, who wanted a Mario Testino picture on his business card, not realizing that this is the world was at the time the world's highest paid fashion photographer, and you can't just take his picture and put it on the data strategy manager's business card.
But this is all about, isn't it, the devaluation of the photographic image, with that idea that if it's that easy to take with your phone, it sort of it devalues to a lot of people, you know, what actually goes on behind the creation of a photographic practice for a professional photographer as well. I always remember back at art directing at the beginning of the 90s, when DTP appeared, and some older people will remember desktop publishing, where suddenly everybody thought they were a graphic designer because they could put a bit of clip art in and they could print something off. And I always thought that was the beginning of the end for that kind of understanding of editorial design. And obviously with photography, we're at a similar kind of a place now, that there isn't that understanding of that education or that respect for the photographer.
Well, the problem is it's feeding, what's happening is the lack of education. As Fiona's saying, is if I had £1 for every time someone had said to me, oh, I found it on Google, it's free, you can use it. And at that point, even when I say, no, you really can't, they'll come back and say, well, what do you know about it? And I think, well, head of photography, I do actually. But, you know, within editorial establishments, when you've got pretty senior editors sort of insisting that everything that you can find on the internet is basically free, it's a real problem, and I'm consistently shocked by it.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, again, referring back, but in our pre-chat, we went on for quite a while and covered a lot of ground. But I do remember back in, again, I'm living in the past of these things that some people will remember. But if you're old enough, you'll remember the dot-com boom of 2000. And I was part of a VC-funded, a venture capitalist, I should say, funded project where their belief was that they would take all of the photographs off of bbc.co.uk because they were free. So, and that was actually in their business plan.
So I was going back over old blog posts of mine yesterday, and I wrote a blog post in 2015 about when I was still at Condé Nast, and it was a roundup of the images of the year that for sharing around the company. And what I wrote was that when you're working with a lot of big, amazing, expensive, top of the range publications and the best photographers and most expensive and so on, and you want to pick the best pictures of the year, obviously there are various things that come into play. Everyone's seen all the American Vogue covers, they've seen the Rihanna and the Beyonce shoots, so you want to find unusual, interesting, better pictures that might have been overlooked. And I wrote that this is the kind of job that senior picture editors are there for. However, I didn't have a senior picture editor, and I said that in 2015, 3 of the most senior picture editors, not all from that company, from different companies, 3 friends of mine who'd all been in their jobs and in the industry for sort of 15, 20 years, were all fired. And they were fired at a time when growth hackers and data analysts were being brought in. And I also said, I remember saying that people who really should know better were saying things like, oh, you can get an intern, or you can get the editor's PA to help you source images, because people did think, oh, you can find everything on Google. And even if you can find everything on Google, it's not where you look, it's what you're looking for. That's the difference.
So if we're talking about that devaluation, and again, I'm old enough to remember when magazines were designed with glue and knives. And when they were designed with glue and knives and scalpels, there was a magic about it. With photography, when we were still analog, there was a kind of a magic chemistry. It was about chemicals and brass and largers. And so it was very difficult for people to actually dip into that world and think they knew about it. Because we're now in a situation that everybody thinks they're a photographer and can take a photograph, and that's fine. I wonder whose role it is, and I suppose I speak here from, we're speaking here from an educational perspective. Whose role is it? Because I think I know, but I'm going to not lead the witness. But to work and educate those above, but also to educate the photographers who are coming to you, because I know a lot of photographers don't actually know the rules because that hasn't been taught, and a lot of the people we're always referred to as being upstairs also don't know the rules. So whose role is it to educate?
Well, it used to be the picture editors, but they got rid of all of those. I say that as one of them. Yeah. I mean, Fiona, what's your view? I mean, I think that picture editors will actually come back because I think that they add to the conversation and to the quality of the result.
I remember having another, like, back memory lane. I remember having a conversation quite a long time ago, probably let's say 10 years ago, with an art director at Thames and Hudson Books, and we were talking about the skills you would need in the future, and we both agreed the skill that would be most needed in the future was picture editing, because there were going to be such a glut of images coming out, and because it was like, well, how do you actually find the right images? And I just think that's so ironic because it actually hasn't worked out like that. But again, it comes down to, you can blame Michael Gove for this. The public is tired of experts. The public may or may not be tired of experts, but they certainly are pretty disrespectful of expertise.
Well, it's quite funny you mentioned Michael Gove, because I worked with him when he was a columnist on Tatler, and he was promoting cheap stories from Parliament to try and become a writer. But so he obviously thought he wanted to be an expert then. But I think, what we're talking about here is this issue that we keep coming back to. And I know, Fiona, you tweeted this morning of how many people within Condé Nast, how many of the editors have just been let go, disappeared, whatever it may be, in the latest purge within editorial. But I'm sort of sticking up for the photographer here and saying, well, okay, what does the photographer do? Because if you're being met with that barrier to connection, if you're not in a situation whereby the art directors and the picture editors are communicating with you and collaborating with you, what do the photographers do?
Well, I would say that I'll stick up for the art directors for a minute, because we've been on this for nearly 15 minutes. We haven't fought yet. The thing is that there's a lot of news this morning about French Vogue, French GQ, French Vanity Fair. We already had Dylan Jones from British GQ announcing on Friday that he is leaving. The editors of Vogue Spain, Vogue China, Vogue Germany, Vogue Japan, and Vogue India have all exited. And those people talk about that because people know who editors are. They don't talk about art directors or a few picture editors who may have been hanging in there, but those people will have lost those jobs or will be losing their jobs as well. And if those people go, well, I don't know what will happen to the magazines, but I think that as Gaby has championed for her entire career, as all three of us, I think, have championed for our career, when we've been working with publications, we will always champion the photographer, not the friend of the person who happened to be there with their camera phone or something. But there are challenges like, I will never forget an issue of a magazine, not in this country, and I wasn't involved, but I remember the publisher very, very proudly telling me they decided as an experiment to do an entire issue not using professional photographers, using the staff and their phones, and they printed it, and it was nobody batted an eyelid. Now, it wasn't a sort of like A-lister magazine, but it was one that you've all heard of. And when you have that kind of attitude, it's really hard to know what to do, where to go with this. But obviously, and the other thing is, you both were mentioning Unsplash the other day. Maybe we should talk a little bit about that, because I didn't know too much of it, but I've done some research on it now. Grant, for anyone who doesn't know, do you want to explain what Unsplash is?
Yeah, I mean, it's like many of, and it gets us into the whole world of photo agencies, basically, this idea of syndication at the lowest price point. I saw that Alamy have just redone all of their price points this week. And the price points, whenever they're done, are always down. And so Unsplash is a harvester of images of people who are happy to see their images used, who don't use photography as a way of earning an income.
And if you look on, so I was just going to say, if you look on Unsplash this morning, they actually have, you know, they have this very nice glossy website. So this kind of like woman with coffee pot, coffee cup, nice sunset, this, that, and the other. And they have a picture from a Free Palestine demonstration in San Francisco. And then you link to the guys, the photographers' work, and there's all this material, and it's all being given away free. And you think, well, how is Getty going to make a living, and how are the photographers who have to work through Getty, how are they going to make a living if people like Unsplash will let you download this stuff for nothing?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, part of my background, back into 99, I think it was, I was working with Mark Getty at Getty to try and shape the new look of what Getty would be as a creative director. And the idea at that time was that stock would go upmarket, and therefore you would get the upmarket clients. It would reinvent itself, and financially that would work for the photographers. Suffice to say, I wasn't there very long because I completely disagreed with the kind of way in which they were kind of presenting work as a product. And I'd come from a situation whereby I was working with people and not just treating them as kind of data. But how can we be positive about this? Certainly, you know, on the course of Brooks, we are bringing the reality of where photography is. But at the same time, I do encourage the use of smartphones. I don't see anything wrong with the encouraging of a different tool. I think that's absolutely fine. I don't criticize the hammer that built the boat, but I might criticize the boat if it's not very well made. So I think that, you know, we can support these things, but in a way, what seems to be coming through this conversation, somewhat depressingly, is that all the people who could have been in position, it used to be art directors, that there were the big art directors in London, were all big names and were listened to, and then they were got rid of. Now the editors have been got rid of, the picture editors. So where does that leave the photographer, do you think, who's trying to kind of identify for themselves a professional practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we're talking about is a market being completely disrupted. And so in some ways, that's a positive thing. And I think as artists, we should be, you know, kind of seeing disruption as an opportunity. That's great. But as you said, there's still some legacy rules that are, you know, hanging around, like the law and stuff like that. But we've also got some really big players in this game, which sort of sneak around. So the disruption in the editorial industry basically is because advertising is dying, because Google and Facebook are taking 99% of the money in the market. And so this is the result, as it devalues everything. It devalues us, it devalues art, it devalues any kind of professional effort, because all of the money is just going to two corporations. But in a positive sense, I do think that people should see it as an opportunity. And what's happening, what I'm seeing, is photographers and artists are having all sorts of different portfolio careers where they're earning their money in one way, and then they're still kind of, you know, doing their art and expressing themselves. And it's a struggle to know how to make money out of it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that idea of a multifaceted practice now is becoming increasingly the case with the opportunities that moving image presents, and all sorts of areas, new areas such as AI and VR. You know, there are areas there that photographers should be able to explore with transferable skills. And perhaps the really key thing, as you quite rightly say, Gaby, that disruption is don't, here we are talking about the past, but don't cling on to the past, because the old models don't work anymore.
They don't. And as a picture editor who was basically pretty disenfranchised, and as somebody who, you know, knows a lot of the picture editors in London, and we're all segueing into different things. I've done a quick segue into tech, you know, and I'm now a co-founder of a tech company, and I still use my photographic skills and my, you know, knowledge and that kind of thing, but it's just to a much lesser extent.
Yeah. Fee, what's your take on that?
I would say, well, you know, all this for for a print lover, for a magazine lover, for an old school art director of magazines, all this terrible news about what's happening to magazines. But it's not new news. It's been going on for a long time. The thing is, those chickens will come home to roost. So, you know, in the long run, and it might not be that long, the long run, while it's terrible that photographers are not going to be, are losing that market, I don't think that the magazines are going to thrive without it either. I don't think that the people who are using Unsplash and who are using the cheap ways of showing images and who are cutting budgets right down, I don't think that they're actually going to kind of win in the end or be that commercially successful. And I think that because people love taking photographs and because people love looking at photographs, there are always going to be new formats. They will be blossoming. And I know, Grant, you and I argued recently last time about independent magazines, but there are a lot of independent magazines. I don't mean the pay per print, the pay to print ones. I mean things like Kinfolk and Serial and ID and Numero and all that kind of stuff. There are tons of magazines that are still going out there, and people have their own ways of putting things together. What I'm coming around to thinking more and more when it comes back to education with photographers is something that we have been saying, but I think we maybe just need to, this might be the thing we're going to push more, is to photographers be more confident and be more persistent and be more aware of your rights and be louder. I mean, if somebody is putting your work on Instagram and not tagging you, make a fuss about it. This is the kind of thing that I think that people have to do. The photographers, for instance, I'm going on about Instagram because it's quite easy, but the photographers who use it well, in that they get lots of likes, they get lots of follows, they get lots of engagement, and they obviously are doing well in their careers. People like, let's say, Chris Floyd and Tom Oldham, they are really good and really engaged and really positive and really proactive, and their voice comes through. So there are a lot of ways nowadays that you can actually be louder as a photographer. You don't have to sort of sit there and take it.
No, but I think the real problem with, particularly with Instagram becoming a gateway for many people into photography, particularly young photographers who are exploring it, is that Instagram is seeing the work out of context. And I think the real problem in understanding photography is actually understanding context as to how, you know, I would say, okay, that's fine, but is that photographer earning money from putting pictures on Instagram or not? Probably not. So it's very easy to become an Instagram hero, but you know, it's very difficult. And I think the difficulty for a photographer is that there are many different kind of calls on that photographer. Oh, you must do this, or you must do that, or you might. I was talking to a journalist on Sunday, and she was saying, oh, she's talking with clients, and they're saying, but I must have Instagram. And she's saying to the client, well, why? You know, you've just got a warehouse. What are you going to photograph? You know, you've got to be aware of how these platforms work. I see somebody in the chat there just mentioned blockchain and the whole situation with NFTs, which I'm not going to go into the non-fungible transactions because that's a whole other area. But it's another call on photographers thinking, but maybe I should do that. And there are photographers like Ruben Wu who's doing amazing stuff with that. But with all these push and pulls, I think it's very difficult for the photographer to really identify, you know, how do I do this?
I mean, I'm not saying that Instagram is the solution from it. I'm just saying that there are many portals out there and platforms and ways of getting your voice heard these days. And if you don't get your voice heard, it's like back in the day when I used to, actually, there's another quote, I tell you. If you don't speak up for yourself, then other people will either speak up for you and you might not like what they say, or else nobody will hear you. Nobody will pay attention. There's another, I just wrote this down this morning because this is Ellen von Unwerth, good quote in The Guardian in 2017. And she said, it's not special anymore to be a photographer. Even when I take a picture, everybody stands next to me and takes the same picture. 5 minutes later, it's on everyone's Instagram and I'm old news. So I'm forced to take pictures on my iPhone too. And I just think that's very, very resonant, and it definitely hasn't changed. But the thing is, you wrote that in 2017. It ain't going away. You have to somehow.
No, but sorry, Gabby, were you going to join in there?
Well, the only thing I would say is that talented people are always one step ahead, and that's basically what the business model was at Condé Nast. Was, you know, they had the best, most talented people who had a vision that was always, you know, 10 steps ahead, and so people were buying it for the shock of the new, the delight and surprise that you would get from this new way of looking at the world. And so people are still doing that. It's very sped up. But in a hopeful way, you know, talent will always rise and find its kind of level, and people will find you if you're really brilliant.
Yeah, but I think tying both those things together there, I think that today there is even more importance on the personal in the work and the person you actually are, because that's what's going to make you stand out. And actually what you're identifying is that creating of being a social being on social media or online, that your personality is coming over as well as the work, because as we all know, as people who've commissioned photographers, we've all given young photographers their first start, and we've all worked with great photographers, you know, the established, the great names. What we're actually looking for is the work, but we're actually also looking for the person. We're actually looking for how is that person going to react in that situation? How are they going to engage with in the situation we're putting them in? Are they going to be able to empathize? Are they going to be able to tell the story, create the narrative? And I think these are skills that we really need to support amongst photographers and encourage them to develop.
Definitely. I mean, I was thinking about briefing earlier because latterly I've seen a lot of really terrible briefs going into photographers, just not very helpful. And actually, we all know the power of a wonderful face-to-face conversation. And it's a shame, you know, I mean, obviously the last 18 months has been disastrous for the entire planet, and it's very difficult to have a conversation with anyone face-to-face. But actually just briefing somebody properly and, you know, really explaining the kind of thing that you're looking for, and then letting them reflect back on that and then reflect that back to you is a useful thing. Yeah.
It is, but I think, you know, I'm going to stick up for the photographers again. I'm taking that role rather than the art director role today. But, you know, if I'm every single time, the one thing that everybody asks is, oh, can you give me choice? And what that means is that the person who's commissioned you is insecure in their position because they're scared to make a decision, because the person above them might not like what they've commissioned. And it goes up and up. And I often give a talk about the good, the bad, and the cappuccino amongst art directors. The good one will stand up for you. The bad one will say, it wasn't my fault. And the cappuccino will just drink a lot of cappuccino and not say anything at all. And I've experienced all three as a photographer, which was pretty shocking for someone who's been an art director for many years, that this way of working was going on. Doesn't help the photographer.
It doesn't, but I think also this comes back to the thing we were talking about right from the beginning, which is, you know, respect and understanding what a photographer is. I mean, I have actually had the delight of doing exactly what you were saying, Gabby, in just before the pandemic, of actually going to have breakfast with a photographer. We were shooting a lookbook. And just having breakfast with a photographer to talk about what the shoot was going to be like. And I think that was the last time I actually was able to sit with somebody and talk about how a shoot would go. And it feels like I couldn't make a movie about it. It was such a special time. But
did you put the breakfast on expenses?
He paid.
Oh.
I don't know why he paid. But anyway, it was it is really special, that meeting of minds, and the people who don't have the confidence and don't have the respect or whatever are not likely to take a photographer or be taken by a photographer to breakfast to talk about how a shoot goes. But as a professional photographer, you can and should always insist on the most clarity you can possibly get. I don't think it is a new thing that there are people who just give a brief saying, give me a choice. As you say, Grant, that's gone back since forever. And you do get to a certain stage in your career And I know it took me a long time to go, right, you know something, we want one shot. That's the shot we want. And when that shot is here and I'm happy with it, we're all going home. But you don't kind of do that at first. And I think nowadays, well, yeah, it takes a while to get confident like that.
I always loved Alexei Brodovich's commissioning, which existed of only 2 words: surprise me. And I always use that, sometimes to my detriment and sometimes to my success, but surprise me.
And as Grant very well knows, I always say to photographers, do not surprise me.
Yeah. It's why we could never have worked together.
We work together all the time.
As photographer and art director. So, but as art director, it wouldn't work. But so really, I think what we're talking about here is education, but also I think I want to draw it to another area, which is I think it is also the photographer's responsibility to understand the role of the client as much as it is the client's responsibility to empathize with the photographer. Because, you know, that idea of the machinations of what happens within a magazine office, within an ad agency, whatever magazine that is, whether it's a small one or a big one, it's really important to identify the appropriate clients for your work, as well as to try and understand how that industry works. And I think too many photographers are very informed about photography, but they're not informed about how the industry they want to work in works.
Definitely. And I think it comes back to there is the education, and obviously, you know, we're doing that. We're teaching photographers at the moment, and we hope that they will take that in. And unfortunately, we cannot personally educate the people who are commissioning the photographers. But then I think this is why it comes back to, the more I've been thinking about it over the last few weeks, the more it is you have to find your voice, your spoken voice and your written voice, as much as your visual voice in your own language. And it doesn't mean that you have to be bolshy or anything, although a little bolshiness every now and then, it's okay, maybe. But it does mean that you have to engage. You really have to engage. You know, it's not like we can say, oh, photographers should go on strike for their rights, because that would never happen. And that would be disaster. But you still have to not lie down and get walked all over. And there's a lot of that happening at the moment.
You're right, but I think as we was again saying the other day, it really is about that idea of education, but also awareness. And I think there is quite often an unrealistic expectation from both sides. I think that because photography has been devalued in the eyes of many who think that they can take great pictures, but at the same time, the photographers are not perhaps doing the amount of work that they need to do. There needs to be more of a coming together. So when you were talking about a breakfast, yeah, that was the case. You know, photographers used to drop in on my office in Vogue House and fall asleep on the floor, you know, and just come in because they knew that they could come in, get a coffee and just hang out, you know, and that was okay.
I think also, you know, one of the things, the good old days again, is that back in those days, what helped with the whole respect for the visual side was that when you did have an art department, we were often in a separate room or in a separate end of the building or the office or whatever, and you had the art director and the designers and the picture editor and the intern or whatever, and you could you were like a gang, and that was one of the ways that that editors and publishers were a little bit afraid of the gang, because we were kind of bolshy back in those days, and unfortunately because of the cuts, because those gangs don't exist to the same extent anymore, it's really affected the camaraderie, and therefore it's taken away its moral support as much as anything else from people who would have come in with their portfolios from photographers.
But I think, you know, what's interesting, and I think about you know, we've covered a lot of area today and a lot of points, and I know there are quite a few things that have come up in the chat that we could maybe address, but these conversations aren't happening enough, I don't think, between photographers and commissioners, photographers and the creative industries and so forth. So I think, as we said, this isn't happening. And I've reached out to people in publishing and said, listen, let's put on a talk. Let's get some photographers. Let's meet. Not interested at all. So maybe we need to form a movement.
We'll try again, because everything's changed so much in the last sort of 18 months that I think, there is this conversation to be had. And I think so many people have turned up today that I think it's testament that there is a conversation that people do want to have.
Yeah, I hope so. Shall we I don't know if there are any questions that want to come through in particular, but if I have a look on the chat, somebody said, I'm just sort of working in reverse order. What is next for the future of photographers? That's a small question.
A portfolio career, maybe.
Yeah, I agree. I think transferable skills is the word I often use. I think it's important now for a photographer to be able to talk about their work, present their work, maybe write about their work, understand moving image and explore moving image alongside the still image, personal work. Fee?
I would say also building a community. I mean, it's just what we're literally just talking about now, but it's also something that comes up quite regularly. And it's a way to get your voice heard, and it's a way to kind of like get yourself some support. A long time ago, I did a talk at the Photographers Gallery with a little group called Photo Debut, and we were having a debate. And one side of the debate was photographers are better working alone, and the other side of the debate was better working in a collective. And I was arguing for the collective, and of course I won. But the thing is, and this was a long time ago. This was 20 years ago, and it was things like, well, you may be better being me, or maybe you're better being part of this agency or whatever. But I think now, building your community so that there's strength in numbers, so you have ideas, you can bounce off people. If you have a problem, that you can talk to other photographers and sympathetic allies in the commissioning world. That's got to be something that builds in the coming months. Let's say years.
I agree with you. I think, the photographer David Eustace always used to say to me, photographers are so selfish, they only let one eye look through the camera. And I think, we're now in a situation whereby collaboration is hugely important. I mean, I do a weekly podcast, A Photographic Life, quick plug, but it's all about the idea of community and collaboration, because I think more of that reaching out, we also can share best practice, we can share experience, which we're doing hopefully today. But what we can also do is be supportive and kind of say, well, yeah, you're not alone. And photography can be very lonely. And certainly during COVID, people can feel very kind of on the outside.
I think we've seen that in what people are producing over the last year, actually. I think you can see it in the photography. And, I'm very much hoping that we can get back to collaboration, because for me as well, that's key. Amazing things happen when you start talking to each other and making friends and connecting, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Are there any other questions that want to come through to us? I'm sorry, James, I'm not sure I forgot what time we're meant to finish. Are we still good?
Yeah, you've still got 15 minutes, so yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, brilliant. Okay. So in that case, let's go through that and try and see on the chat. I'm going to go right up to see what we can see. Somebody did say about here, the potential to cut out middlemen and agencies could be very beneficial to artists and photographers. What are your feelings about that? I'm kind of... I've got something to say, but what do you think, Abby? You suddenly...
Yeah, well, I mean, as part of the digital photography scene, it's really interesting. I mean, Getty made a decision a long time ago to completely dominate the market. And the problem is when you have an enormous actor in a specific market, it creates a dangerous situation where you're kind of either in or you're outside the castle walls, and they also aggressively acquire. So even if you build you know, a magnificent individual agency built with heart and love and soul, they will come along and be very interested if you do a good job. It's not good. And I mean, I know Harriet Wilson has fought very hard for agencies to kind of stay separate because she believes that's a better model for the marketplace. In terms of getting rid of any agencies, so it was just a free-for-all. I mean, blockchain is going to be enormously useful. I mean, it's an incredible piece of technology, and we don't even know what's going to kind of happen yet. And it will be very, very useful for people to be able to trace usage and that kind of thing. We're not there yet. It's all very exciting, but we need some time to be able to build those kinds of things. Yeah, but anyone can set up a website.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I have to say, from my perspective, I think one of the things that I talk to photographers about, and I probably mentor about 30 photographers at the minute, informally, and it's always the same question, which is, how do I get commission? And I always had the same answer, which I should really just play a tape, because I'm very boring and say the same thing every time. But it's really about identifying who uses the work that you create. And because you'll always be commissioned to take the picture you've taken, not the one you could take.
Yeah.
And therefore, by identifying brands, and it fits in, I think, to a certain extent, what we're all saying here, is that if magazines disappear, but the community is important, then brands are recognizing that it's important for them to build community around their brands. So the perfect example of this is Rafa, the cycling clothing company, who have a magazine, they have fantastic websites and films, sponsorship of teams. So they're totally embedded within their community and have various touch points. So if you're really passionate about cycling and you're taking pictures similar to kind of what Rafa are producing, then you can go direct to Rafa. You don't have to go through an ad agency or through somebody else. So that identification of brand around the work you create, and then contacting those brands through their press office or their marketing departments, in a sense, takes out the middleman and can be very fruitful. But obviously, it also relies on you being able to identify what makes a good client. Fee.
I was thinking that I don't think there's necessarily a good or a bad about the middleman situation. I mean, there are good agencies, there are bad agencies, there are reasons to have them, there are reasons not to have them. And I think the most important point is to kind of like keep tabs on who is being good and who is not being good. I mean, you know, basically, if Magnum had never been launched, that would probably have curtailed some of the developments of great photography in the 20th century. But you might not feel nowadays that with one thing and another, Magnum is a shining beacon of morality and ethics and what have you. But that doesn't mean you can't really throw out babies in bathwater. So I think it's, again, we're coming back to the sort of the individual photographer has to continuously be keeping tabs on what do I need, who am I associating with. I can't sign and go, right, I'm signing with this person or this agency or this library now, and I'll be with them for the next 20 years. Everything is changing too fast nowadays. You've got to review these things.
Yeah, and as I said, I remember talking to Mark Getty when he and I were going around the world buying everything, and it didn't feel very right then. It was my fault. However, what followed wasn't my fault. So I think that constant evolution is what makes a lot of photographers feel uneasy. But I do think that if they can identify those key elements that actually constitutes somebody who is a professional photographer who's working in that way, rather than someone who's taking a photograph. And I was talking yesterday about something. I was listening to Radio 1, I know, but a few weeks ago, and they were talking about mobile phones and getting a new mobile phone. And those mobile phone companies now are making the big money on selling you storage space. That's where that's going. And there were people, Radio 1 listeners, saying, yeah, I've got 30,000 images on my phone. I've got 40,000 images on my phone. And that's what they're storing on that phone. And that's what they're paying for the storage. Well, that's an archive. That's a photographic archive. Yeah, I'm supposed to be a photographer and somebody interested in photography. I've got about 30 pictures on my phone. if that, I know you're much better at that, Fiona, than I am. So we are in that situation where people who are actually acting like photographers in the amount of work they're creating and what they're documenting are not perceiving themselves as being photographers, because they would never recognize that, because they have a perception. And then you've got professional photographers who want to earn a living out of it, confused by exactly what the perception should be that they should be giving off to the commissioner. Does that make sense?
Well, it's whatever gives the work value, yeah. And it's a difficult one. I mean, there are trawling engines. I don't know if people are aware of this. Getty's famously got a trawling engine that sort of grabs people who've stolen their work and sues them for vast amounts of money. But the trawling engine is very expensive to run at the moment. And obviously it's trawling the entire internet, which is trillions and trillions of pictures. It's difficult for people to keep track. But yeah, that blockchain is going to be interesting to watch on that.
And what about, what's your feelings about that, Fee, as to that difference between the photographer and the person who takes a photograph?
I think that semantics is really important. I call myself an art director, and I call myself an art director because I have actually had that title on mastheads and in HR departments over the years. But I was interviewed. Was what made you decide to be an art director? And I'm like, well, no one decides to be an art director. You go to art college because you like design or magazines or posters or whatever it is. And then you come out and you get a job and you're an assistant or a freelancer or a baby junior, and then you become a designer and then you work your way up. And I think that nowadays there's this real thing about people want to be, they think I can be an art director, I can be a creative director when they're in college. The thinking that this means something. It doesn't actually mean anything. And it's kind of the same thing as a photographer. You can't just say, I'm going to be a photographer when I grow up. You become that role, that job title, through experience, education, skills, more experience, and being good at your job. I don't think anyone is. I think semantics is really a big part of it. And yeah, I think photographers need to kind of go, well, I did go to college, or I did not go to college, but I have paid my dues. I have done this. I have learned this. I can run a shoot. I can pay my assistant. I can work in a studio. I know about lighting. You have to kind of understand, back to the very beginning of our topic here, what is a photographer? What does that mean?
Yeah.
So
it almost, yeah, no, genius. It's almost as if the whole hour was planned there, as you brought us back to the beginning. There's a wonderful kind of segue. But it's true, because it brings us back to education, which is really the key to all of this, isn't it? It's the photographer educating themselves. As I said previously, art departments used to be full of people who'd studied photography or illustration or graphics, and we all had an interest in the arts, and therefore that was our respect. That is not the situation now. There's a huge amount of people in a position to commission photography who know absolutely nothing about photography and have got no training in the subject whatsoever. But I think it's really useful for the photographer to know that, and to realize that, and to recognize that it's actually their responsibility to actually identify who they are and what they do and what they're bringing to the party. Because if they don't know, you can't expect the person commissioning you to know. So you really do need to know how to work. You need to know about copyright. You need to understand that. I mean, somebody's just been there, how do you educate the commissioners who don't know? I think that's actually kind of what I'm saying now, is that I think you need to take that with you. And I know that now, as a photographer, I work with many people much, much younger than me who don't have as much experience as I do as an art director or as a commissioner. And so I have to see it as my role to go, yeah, maybe that isn't such a great idea. And maybe we could do this. And actually, no, you can't have my copyright for that. but I can give you a license for this, and we can do this way. And the line I often use when art directors ask me to do something is, if I was a good photographer, I'd do it, but I'm actually not that good. And I find that works rather well when they're asking you to do something that neither a camera or a lens or any photographer could achieve. So yeah, I think the key is the photographer needs to be educated, and then they can hopefully educate the commissioner. But you've also got to identify who's a bad client and be willing to walk away. And be willing to walk away from a bad client and just say, that doesn't work for me. Yeah. So, sorry, Fee, go on.
I was just going to add to that, that I think that everything we're coming back to, everything we've been saying this morning or this afternoon comes back to the same kind of thing, which is, well, certainly for me it does, which is find your voice and find your community. And if you can't find your community, start building a community. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Gaby, is there anything you feel that we haven't covered, or you think we really should have said that?
No, not really. I mean, I suppose I think the next 2 years are going to be absolutely critical with this. I'm watching with sort of fascinated horror what's happening to traditional editorial, and we all, you know, we've known for sort of 20 years that this was coming, but actually the rapid decline is really rather alarming. But actually, to be fair, Anna Wintour is basically trying to completely redesign the business model, and that's a difficult task. So I just can't wait to see, yeah, if it works.
Well, it's interesting because my wife, who's actually in the house now editing a magazine, because she's the editor of an interiors magazine, and she's just had the best year they've had for ages, because everyone's interested in homes, and it's an interiors magazine. So suddenly everybody wants to decorate their home. So I think there is a future for publishing, but you're quite right. The big publishers, the Hearst, the Condé Nast, the Time Incs, they're in big trouble. And they were the ones who kind of led the industry. And if they go, what's going to happen is that although all these little independent magazines that Fiona talks about are wonderful, they're very small, they don't make anybody any money, and they don't actually have very much power in the bigger scheme of things, although that they do good work. So really, it comes back to the photographer, I think. Fee?
I think also one thing that actually the one thing we haven't really touched on here, we've been talking as if it's all happening in the same place, but it's not all happening in the same place. And this is a worldwide international situation. When I was first working in Russian Vogue, in Russian Cosmo, even in 1995, there were not the resources or anything else for taking the kind of pictures that were running in American Cosmo, for example. But nowadays, if you look at a Russian magazine, a Thai magazine, a Chinese magazine, an Arabian magazine, they all are at the same level as any American or European title, because the talent is there and the resources have become there, and because it's cheaper a lot of the time. I mean, you know, you see fantastic shoots done in parts of the world where you kind of go, well, this would cost, you know, $60,000 to shoot it in New York or London, and there's no way that title in Brazil or Mexico could spend $60,000 on that. But that's because they have lower overheads. And I think what's going to be very interesting going forward is where the next Mario Testino comes from, the next Ellen von Unworth come from. They will actually, even though Mario is of course Peruvian, but their work will be appearing in places that we haven't seen yet. Yeah. And that's going to be really exciting.
I agree. Just to finish up, and I'm going to put on my podcast hat now and bring us in on time. I'm just going to say you can follow Fiona Hayes on Twitter and Instagram at The Art Dictator. No surprise there with that particular tag, as you will have guessed. If you're interested in anything I've said, you can follow me on @UNOfPhoto, UnitedNationsOfPhotography.com, and on the weekly podcast, A Photographic Life, available on all podcast platforms. And Gaby, where do we follow you?
I'm easy to find. I'm GabyCove.com.
There you go. You follow Gaby. Over to you, James.
So much, Scott, thank you so much for putting this together. It's been a brilliant event. We've had some amazing discussions going on in the chat, and people have been here from all over the world. So it's been a privilege to be part of it. So thanks to Grant, to Fiona, to Gabby. Please don't forget to come along to the documentary on Thursday night. Do sign up to that on the website, and sign up to some more events. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you all soon. Okay.
Great. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.